The packed congressional chamber trembled with an energy so sharp it felt like static in the air. Every seat was filled, every corridor lined, and every lens locked on the hearing table, where two figures sat facing off under the unforgiving glare of white-hot lights. Flashes from photographers lit the room like lightning, but no one blinked. No one dared. In the center of it all sat Jasmine Crockett, her posture perfectly steady, her gaze unwavering. Across from her, Mike Johnson leaned forward with calculated confidence, his voice having just dripped with condescension moments earlier. For the last half hour, he had been circling her like a predator, his questions sharp, rehearsed, and designed to corner her. Every word carried the swagger of a man convinced he had the upper hand. And then, it happened. Jasmine's lips parted, and with a calmness so controlled, it cut through the tension like a blade. She delivered the line that no one in the room, not Johnson, not the committee, not the millions watching online, ever saw coming. Silence. On a breath. Not a whisper, not even the shuffle of papers dared to interrupt the moment. It was as if the entire country froze on its axis, the gravity of her words sinking in second by second. On the far side of the chamber, a reporter instinctively lowered his pen. Two staffers exchanged stunned glances. A senator's jaw actually dropped, and Mike Johnson, the man who moments earlier seemed untouchable, sat back, blinking hard, his carefully curated composure cracking under the weight of her words. Nobody could have predicted what came next. Nobody could have imagined how one response could ripple through the halls of Washington, spark a nationwide conversation, and ignite a firestorm across social media. But to understand why this single moment shook Washington to its core, we need to rewind the clock to understand the weight of this confrontation. You have to picture the stakes stacked higher than ever before. This wasn't just another hearing, it was the kind of moment Washington lives for, the kind that makes or breaks careers, defines political legacies, and sends shockwaves across the country. The committee chamber had been buzzing. Long before Jasmine Crockett and Mike Johnson ever exchanged words, millions of Americans were already watching live, knowing the hearing would determine the future of a policy that cut right to the heart of identity, dignity, and representation. Tensions between parties had reached a boiling point. Democrats framed the issue as a fight for fairness and equality, while Republicans painted it as a battle to preserve order. Neither side was backing down, and the entire country was split down the middle. Jasmine Crockett walked into that room carrying more than just briefing papers and legal precedents. She carried the weight of the people who sent her there, people who'd spent years fighting to be seen, heard, and respected. To them, she wasn't just another lawmaker. She was a voice for families pushed to the margins, a defender of those who felt invisible in the halls of power. On the other side sat Mike Johnson, projecting the quiet arrogance of a man certain victory was his. Every gesture, every smirk, every meticulously worded question carried the air of someone who believed he could outmaneuver anyone who dared challenge him. In his mind, Crockett was just another opponent to corner, another soundbite to exploit. But here's what neither Johnson nor his allies understood. This wasn't just about policy. This was personal. This was about identity, dignity, and the promise of America itself. Viewers had no idea they were about to witness one of the most unexpected congressional takedowns of the year. And in that moment, as Johnson prepared his next line of attack, he couldn't have known that his carefully laid plan had one fatal flaw, to understand why this clash was destined to explode. You have to understand Mike Johnson, not the version broadcast on cable news, but the man behind the curtain, the strategist who built his entire reputation on precision, control, and the illusion of authority. In Washington, Mike is known for his polish, the tailored navy suits, the deliberate cadence of his words, the carefully practiced pauses, all of it designed to project calm dominance. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. He commands attention through posture and poise. His every movement calculated to communicate power without appearing aggressive. It's this controlled confidence that earned him headlines and made him a rising star within his party. But behind the polish lies something colder. Mike Johnson is a tactician. For weeks leading up to this hearing, his team prepared a strategy meant to dismantle Jasmine Crockett's credibility. They compiled talking points, cherry-picked quotes, and rehearsed scenarios to trap her in soundbites he could later weaponize. For Mike, this wasn't just about policy, it was about optics, leverage, and dominance. Privately, Johnson was convinced this would be his moment. His inner circle had whispered it for days. This hearing would cement his authority, bolster his influence, and score him a decisive win over one of the most outspoken Democratic voices on the committee. He studied Jasmine Crockett's speeches, combed through her interviews, and planned to hit her where she seemed most vulnerable, her passion. Johnson believed he could exploit it. He thought he could provoke Crockett into reacting, paint her as emotional, and frame himself as the calm, rational adult in the room. To his supporters, that would translate into strength. To his opponents, it would look like composure under fire. He wanted to win both narratives at once. The arrogance in his approach was impossible to ignore. As he entered the committee room that morning, his expression was serene, almost smug. He nodded confidently to his aides, straightened his tie, and settled into his seat with the ease of a man who believed he'd already won. Every glance he cast at Crockett carried a subtle undertone, a silent message. You're not ready for me. But arrogance always leaves cracks, and those cracks were beginning to show. While his words were measured, his body betrayed him in small, telling ways. The slight lean forward when he posed a question. The tight grip on his pen when she responded without hesitation. The fleeting moments where his jaw tensed as Crockett refused to yield ground. These weren't the reactions of a man in complete control. They were the micro-expressions of someone who expected dominance and wasn't getting it. Yet Johnson doubled down. He believed in the script his team had crafted, a narrative where he played the intellectual superior, dismantling his opponent piece by piece. What he failed to account for was Crockett's unshakable composure and razor-sharp intellect, qualities he had underestimated from the start. And there was another contradiction buried deep beneath the surface: the public mic versus the private mic. In speeches, he framed himself as a defender of American values, a champion of fairness and integrity. But inside those closed-door prep sessions, fairness was never the goal. The goal was control. The goal was dominance. The goal was to force Crockett into a corner she couldn't escape from. That was his miscalculation. Because while Mike Johnson rehearsed every possible move, he had overlooked the one thing you can't script: authenticity. Jasmine Crockett didn't need a playbook to defend herself. She was the playbook. Her strength wasn't in volume or theatrics, but in clarity, precision, and unwavering purpose. And as Johnson leaned forward, ready to spring the trap he thought he had set, there was a quiet storm brewing across the table. Meanwhile, Crockett was quietly preparing something Mike never saw coming. Long before Jasmine Crockett became the woman holding her ground in one of Washington's most high-stakes hearings, she was a little girl growing up in the heart of Texas, in a neighborhood where dreams were big, but opportunities were scarce. Her parents worked long hours to provide for their family, instilling in her the value of hard work and the belief that dignity wasn't something anyone could hand you. It was something you earned, step by step, through resilience. From an early age, Jasmine understood struggle. She watched neighbors fight to keep their homes, saw friends' parents lose jobs, and grew up in a community where standing up for yourself wasn't just a choice, it was survival. That environment shaped her into someone who learned early on to speak truth, even when her voice shook, to confront injustice even when the odds were stacked against her. Education became her escape and her weapon. While classmates doubted whether they'd make it out of their zip code, Jasmine buried herself in books, hungry to understand the systems around her, not to fit into them, but to challenge them. Scholarships, part-time jobs, sleepless nights. She took every obstacle and turned it into fuel. Law school sharpened her edge, but it wasn't the prestige that drove her. It was purpose. She wanted to use the law to give a voice to those who'd been silenced, to challenge the systems that made people like her parents fight twice as hard to get half as far. As a young public defender, she walked into courtrooms where the odds were against her every single time, underfunded, overworked, and facing opponents with far more resources. But she didn't flinch. She fought for clients who'd been discarded, ignored, and written off. And every win, no matter how small, was proof that persistence could chip away at power. The sacrifices were constant. While her peers climbed corporate ladders and cashed bonuses, Jasmine spent nights at her desk preparing cases, mornings, walking into courtrooms with files in her arms and fire in her chest. She lost weekends, holidays, and even friendships along the way. But she gained something deeper: unshakable composure. The kind that can't be taught, and that composure became her greatest strength. By the time Jasmine stepped into the political arena, she wasn't just another representative. She was a fighter forged by experience, a woman who knew firsthand what was at stake for the people she served. Her speeches didn't sound rehearsed because they weren't, they were lived. Every word she spoke carried the weight of someone who had walked the path her constituents were still on. That authenticity made her fearless. Jasmine didn't posture for cameras or craft soundbites to score points. She spoke with conviction, dignity, and clarity. She was relatable without ever pandering, strong without ever needing to shout, and principled in a way that made even her critics grudgingly respect her resolve. And yet, beneath the calm exterior was fire. Jasmine knew what it meant to be underestimated. She had spent years walking into rooms where her intelligence was doubted, her passion dismissed, and her presence questioned. She'd been told to wait her turn, to tone it down, to play the game, but she refused to shrink to make others comfortable. That refusal is what carried her into this hearing, and why she sat there, spine straight, eyes steady, fully prepared to face whatever Mike Johnson threw at her. She knew what he saw when he looked at her. Someone young, someone passionate, someone he believed he could rattle. But what he didn't see, what he couldn't possibly understand, was that everything she'd endured up to this moment had prepared her. For this exact fight, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just defending herself that day. She was defending every person who had been dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated, and she wasn't about to let Mike Johnson or anyone else define her worth. And when the moment finally arrived, Crockett didn't just defend herself. She rewrote the entire narrative. The tension in the chamber was palpable. So thick, it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Under the harsh committee lights, Mike Johnson leaned forward, eyes sharp, a faint smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. This was his moment. For the past hour, he'd sat patiently, letting others speak, letting anticipation build. But now, it was his turn, and he was ready to strike. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, his tone measured but laced with quiet condescension. "You've made some interesting claims today, but wouldn't you agree that your position on this policy contradicts the very principles you've sworn to uphold?" It wasn't a question, it was a trap, a loaded framing designed to corner her, to force her into defending herself rather than presenting her case. Across the room, reporters leaned forward, pens ready, knowing Johnson was setting up a headline moment, but Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. Her expression remained calm, almost serene, as she clasped her hands together on the table. "I would agree," she said softly, "that the principles I've sworn to uphold are exactly why I'm sitting here today, to defend the people who sent me." The response was measured, controlled, and devastatingly effective. A quiet ripple moved through the audience. Staffers glanced at one another, sensing the subtle shift in momentum. Mike Johnson, however, wasn't ready to concede ground. He raised his voice slightly, layering his next question with sharper edges. "So, are you suggesting that the laws we've drafted, laws meant to preserve integrity and protect our institutions, are irrelevant?" The words hung heavy in the air. Cameras zoomed in. A bead of sweat traced down a reporter's temple. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, refusing to let his framing dictate her answer. "I'm suggesting," she replied evenly, "that laws are only as strong as the people they serve. And if they fail to represent every American, then maybe it's the laws that need defending, not me." A murmur spread through the crowd. Even some of Johnson's allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But Johnson, refusing to relent, leaned in further. "Congresswoman," he pressed, his voice tightening, "your passion is admirable, but passion can't replace reason. Would you at least concede that your rhetoric risks dividing this country even further?" It was the line he'd been building toward, the one rehearsed, perfected, and weaponized to paint Crockett as emotional, unstable, and unfit to lead. But Jasmine Crockett saw it coming. She didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't let him control the narrative. Instead, she paused. The silence was deafening. Every camera zoomed tighter. Every viewer watching live at home leaned closer to their screens. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, deliberate, and quiet enough to make the entire chamber strain to hear. "Congressman," she said, her gaze locking onto his, "if the truth divides this country, maybe the problem isn't my passion, maybe it's your comfort with silence." For a moment, the room froze. Even the clicking of cameras stopped. Johnson blinked, visibly rattled, struggling to compose his next move. The verbal chess match was no longer his to control. Every attempt to corner her had slipped through his fingers like water. And with each passing second, the balance of power tilted further in her favor. Staffers on both sides exchanged glances, realizing they were witnessing the prelude to something extraordinary. The energy in the room shifted entirely. The air grew heavy with anticipation. Everyone could sense it. The turning point was coming. But then, Jasmine Crockett dropped the line that no one saw coming. For a moment, the chamber felt suspended in time. The tension was so thick it pressed down on everyone present, choking the oxygen out of the room. Mike Johnson leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing, prepared to deliver his next line of attack. To him, the last few exchanges had been a stumble, nothing he couldn't recover from. He still believed he could steer the narrative, still believed the cameras would capture his dominance. But Jasmine Crockett had already shifted the energy. She sat still, hands folded neatly in front of her, her gaze locked on Johnson with the calm intensity of someone who knew she didn't need to rush. Every beat of silence she allowed dragged the audience deeper into suspense, each pause calculated without ever feeling forced. And then, softly, she began. "Congressman," she said, her tone even, her cadence deliberate. "You've spent the better part of this hearing trying to paint me as someone who doesn't understand the weight of my responsibility. But let me remind you, I carry not just my own voice into this room, but the voices of millions of Americans whose lives are directly impacted by the policies we debate." A ripple moved through the chamber. Crockett's tone wasn't sharp or accusatory. It was calm, grounded, and devastatingly certain. Johnson opened his mouth to interject, but she didn't give him the chance. "You've positioned yourself," she continued, leaning in slightly, "as the arbiter of what's rational, what's lawful, what's right. But rationality without empathy isn't leadership. It's control. And control," she paused, letting the silence stretch, "is not the same as justice." A low murmur spread among the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously. On social media, live stream chat threads exploded with fire emojis and all caps commentary. Johnson shifted in his seat, a faint crease forming on his forehead. He tried to summon his rehearsed composure, but the mask was starting to slip. Still, he pushed forward. Congresswoman, this isn't about empathy. This is about facts. The facts are, she cut him off. Not with volume, but precision. No, Congressman, this is about whose facts get to define America. Yours, or the families who live the realities you legislate from behind this desk. Gasps audible, sharp, unrestrained. A staffer on Johnson's side buried his face in his hands. Across the aisle, a Democratic aide bit back a smile, and then came the moment that would dominate headlines, Twitter feeds, and TikTok clips for days. Jasmine Crockett's mic drop line. She leaned back slightly, her voice soft enough to force the room to lean in, but firm enough to carry like a bell. You came here today expecting to teach me a lesson, she said slowly, deliberately. But what you forgot, Congressman, is that people like me have been learning lessons our whole lives. We learned to navigate systems designed to exclude us. We learned to succeed when the odds were stacked against us. And we learned to speak truth, even when the room wasn't ready to hear it. The silence was deafening. Cameras zoomed tighter. Reporters froze mid-note. A senator in the back actually mouthed, "Wow." Johnson sat frozen, his jaw tight, his pen tapping unconsciously against the table, a telltale sign of unraveling composure. He tried to gather himself, but each attempt to interject would have only made things worse. His confidence, so carefully curated, was visibly cracking under the weight of Crockett's unshakable.com. Crockett, however, wasn't finished. I represent the people who've been ignored when policies were written, she said, her voice growing steadier, sharper. The workers whose names never make it into reports, the families who worked at jobs and still get left behind, the immigrants who came here chasing the promise of something better and found walls instead of bridges. You might dismiss their pain as rhetoric, Congressman, but I live it, and I will not apologize for fighting for them. By now, the room had transformed into something else entirely. It wasn't just a hearing anymore, it was a reckoning. Every syllable she spoke carried the weight of history, identity, and a collective exhaustion with being unheard. And for the first time since the hearing began, Mike Johnson had no response. He sat back in his chair, silent, staring down at his notes as if they'd somehow betrayed him. The cameras caught it, the subtle collapse of control, the shift in power so dramatic it was impossible to ignore. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. In that moment, her composure was the statement. Reporters in the gallery typed frantically, knowing they'd just witnessed the headline moment of the year. On Twitter, the hashtag Crockett clapback trended within minutes, memes flooding timelines before Johnson even had the chance to regroup. And yet, as seismic as the moment felt, no one in the room could have predicted what came next. Because the real storm began after the cameras stopped rolling, *. The moment Jasmine Crockett delivered her devastating comeback, the impact didn't just stay within the four walls of the congressional hearing, it detonated across the nation like a political earthquake. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. News outlets scrambled to push breaking alerts, and social media became a storm of flashing notifications. Trending hashtags and viral memes. #Crockett clapback shot to the top of X, TikTok, and Instagram within an hour. Short clips of the exchange flooded feeds, each one more dramatic than the last, and every frame carried the same electric energy. Crockett's unshakable calm against Mike Johnson's unraveling composure. Users across the country stitched, duetted, and reposted the moment, adding captions like, "She said what we're all thinking," and "Crockett for president." For millions of Americans, especially those long frustrated by political grandstanding, this wasn't just entertainment, it was validation. It was watching someone, finally, speak truth to power with poise and precision. People who had never watched a congressional hearing before were suddenly glued to every second, replaying Crockett's words, memorizing them, and sharing them like a rallying cry. Cable news channels quickly joined the frenzy. Progressive commentators hailed Crockett as the people's prosecutor, praising her composure under pressure and her ability to dismantle Johnson's framing without raising her voice. Even, typically, neutral anchors admitted, live on air, that they had never seen a congressional takedown executed with such surgical precision. Celebrities jumped in, late-night hosts replayed the clip with dramatic music, comedians turned it into sketches, and high-profile activists called it a historic turning point for representation in Congress. Even rival politicians, some who had sparred with Crockett in the past, openly applauded her courage, knowing that the moment transcended party lines. But the response wasn't just praise, it was participation. People felt part of a collective movement. Hashtags like #Team Crockett and #TruthSpoken became digital badges of pride. Across timelines and group chats, Americans celebrated that someone, finally, had stood in the fire and refused to burn. And yet, while the nation was still reeling, Jasmine Crockett was already preparing for something even bigger. Because as powerful as this moment was, it wasn't the end of her story. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't done making history. When the storm finally settled and the cameras dimmed, one truth remained. Jasmine Crockett had done more than win an argument. She had shifted the narrative. What unfolded in that packed congressional chamber wasn't just political theater. It was a reminder of what leadership rooted in dignity, courage, and representation truly looks like. In the hours and days following the viral confrontation, Crockett used her platform with precision and grace. She didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate Johnson's embarrassment. Instead, she reframed the entire debate, steering the conversation away from political rivalries and toward the values that matter most: truth, accountability, and the power of one voice standing against intimidation. In an interview shortly after the hearing, Crockett said softly but firmly, "This was never about me versus Mike Johnson. This was about showing that you can't silence people who stand for justice, no matter how loud the opposition gets." That statement resonated across the country. For countless Americans who have felt unheard, overlooked, or dismissed, Crockett's calm defiance became a symbol of something far greater than politics. It became a rallying cry for courage. What she demonstrated in that room wasn't just the art of debate. It was the power of composure under pressure. While Johnson tried to control the narrative with loaded questions and aggressive framing, Crockett showed that strength isn't always loud, and power doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes, it's the quiet, deliberate truth that leaves the deepest impact. This moment served as a reminder to millions watching. Your voice matters, especially when you're standing up for what's right. Representation matters because it tells future generations, especially young women, immigrants, and marginalized communities, that their stories, their struggles, and their dignity deserve to be heard. But Jasmine Crockett's rise wasn't just about one viral takedown. It was about changing the expectations of leadership in America, about showing that integrity, empathy, and courage can cut through the noise and win. And yet, this wasn't just about one viral moment. Mike Johnson walked into that hearing believing he held all the cards. He came armed with his confidence, his practiced smirk, and a strategy designed to trap Jasmine Crockett into silence. But instead, it was Mike who found himself cornered, not by aggression, but by brilliance. In one defining moment, Crockett flipped the script, turning his carefully laid plan into his own undoing. That's why this moment resonated so deeply across the nation. It wasn't just about politics. It wasn't about parties or positions. It was about standing your ground when someone tries to diminish your worth. Jasmine Crockett reminded millions of Americans, especially those who've been overlooked or underestimated, that strength isn't about power plays. It's about refusing to be silenced. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lose her composure. And yet, her words landed like thunder, shifting the entire energy of the room and rewriting the narrative in real time. For many watching, this wasn't just a congressional exchange. It was a personal victory, a validation of their own frustrations and hopes. Jasmine Crockett showed us all that dignity, truth, and courage can stand toe-to-toe with arrogance and win. And now, it's your turn to make your voice heard. If you believe in holding the powerful accountable, if you believe that voices like Crockett's deserve a bigger platform, then don't just watch this moment, amplify it. Like, subscribe, and share this video so more people see the truth. More voices get heard, and more stories like this can be told. Because this isn't just one victory in one room. It's a reminder, every voice matters, including yours.